So welcome all of you. Thanks for coming back, and welcome to new people. So this is the second in a 12-part series, and we're looking at the mystery of Israel and the church. Last week we introduced it with the notion of the Messiah and his place in salvation history, and the reason for choosing Israel, we said, was precisely for the sake of the Messiah. Israel was chosen to be a people in which the Messiah would be born. And God prepares the things that he does in a divine way. And so he prepared for the Son of God's coming into the world with 2,000 years of the Jewish people in history. So that's what we, just in a nutshell, what we did last time. And what I'd like to do today, next week, and the week after, God willing, is to look at the prophecies in the Old Testament about the Messiah. So this will be biblical today and next week. And we'll look at what does the Old Testament tell us about the Messiah and how we recognize him. And we'll look at the progression of it, because it's a story that unfolds in history and in the scriptures. And so we'll look at it from the beginning, and we'll get about halfway through tonight, I imagine, and then we'll continue next week. Okay? Now, just briefly, as an introduction, I've given you some of you the text that'll make it easier to follow some of the biblical text. So if you have that, you can look along. Okay. Just to situate this, the Jewish people have always believed in the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah, and it's one of the pillars of Jewish faith. Right? And we find, just to show you that I'm not making that up, I've given you here the 13 pillars of Judaism by one of the great rabbis of all time, Rabbi Moses Maimonides, who lived in Spain in the 12th century, and he was a source also for great Catholic theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas knew the works of Moses Maimonides and quoted them, etc. And so Moses Maimonides gives a list of the fundamental beliefs of Judaism. God is the creator, the first point, the only God. He's a spirit. He transcends everything he's created. He's the first and the last. He alone can be worshipped. All the words of the prophets are true. The Bible is true. Moses is the father of all wise men, and all his prophecies are true likewise. Every part of the law now in our hands has come to us by Moses. That's the Mosaic law he's speaking of. That law will never change or be superseded, and we'll have to talk about that. This would be the only point that would need to be discussed between us and Moses Maimonides. But we'll do that later in another talk, further down the line. The Creator knows all the thoughts and deeds of men. He rewards the good, punishes the wicked. The Messiah will surely come. That's what we're interested in. And we must wait for him, no matter how long he delays. And then finally, the dead will rise, the resurrection of the dead, at the time set by God. And no one can be a true Jew, according to Maimonides, if he doesn't profess all these articles as true. Okay. So we've seen in the last talk that the center of God's plan is the incarnation of God the Son, who enters human history to redeem it and to redeem the glory of God, right? Which was the purpose of creation, but is defaced by sin. Right? Is trampled on. God's glory is trampled on by sin, and our happiness is destroyed by sin. And so God himself comes into history to redeem history and to redeem God's glory. And the preparation, we said, was the Jewish people, whose life was to center on this expectation. So let's look at the prophecies. And we'll see whether they, of course, we believe in the church that those prophecies are realized in Jesus Christ. Christ means simply the Messiah. It's the Greek for Messiah. So in Hebrew it would be Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ. First of all, no other figure in history has been the subject of prophecy like Jesus the Messiah. For 2,000 years, century after century, new prophecies introduced. And especially, this is very important to keep in mind, when we look at other religions and other founders of religions. How many prophecies preceded Muhammad? Zero. Right? That's very important to know. And we'll compare that with all the prophecies we'll look at this week and next week. How many prophecies even prepared for Moses? None that I know of. Right? The prophecies center on the Messiah. Okay. And again, that makes sense. Because if we're to believe that God enters human history is not something that you just can do like that. It would be, St. Thomas Aquinas has a beautiful article in one of his works in which he says, is it imprudent to believe in mysteries that exceed reason, that transcend reason? And he answers, it would be if no motives of credibility were given. In other words, if somebody just walks into history and says, I'm God, or I'm the Redeemer, and he doesn't offer proofs that he's speaking in God's name, it would be unreasonable and gravely imprudent to believe him. Right? That's very important. Because to believe it, if it's not true, it's a blasphemy. Right? And so when God speaks in such a way, or when someone claims to speak in the name of God in such a way, saying that they are the Redeemer of mankind, they have to come with credentials. And those credentials need to be also objective, something that can be verified in history that we can evaluate reasonably in accordance with our nature as rational creatures. Okay, so what are those motives of credibility, those credentials that Jesus Christ comes into the world with? Well, the first one is precisely the prophecies that came before him. Okay, and so we have to evaluate that, and we have to look at it using also our reason and using science. The other great motive of credibility is his miracles. Although we weren't witnesses, we have the word of witnesses. And then the third is what came afterwards. But we'll deal with that in another talk. That's the founding of the church and its continuance until today. Okay, we'll look at that next week or the week after, because many of the prophecies also discuss it. So today we'll look at the first motive of credibility, the prophecies that speak of the Messiah. And here I think it's fair to say that Catholics very often are too ignorant of these testimonies. We don't know the reasons of credibility for our faith, and very often people, we pass on our faith as if it's just simply something social. Right? I'm Catholic, and so my children have to be Catholic, and I don't pass them the reasons for belief. Because, first of all, very often we don't know them. Right? So it's important to study these prophecies so that we know also those motives of credibility. And then we can use them in discussion with others who don't yet believe. And furthermore, God took great pains to prepare these prophecies. So even from that point of view, we should know them. One of the early martyrs of the church, great theologian, martyr of the 2nd century, St. Justin Martyr, he said, quote, "With what reason should we believe of a crucified man that he is the firstborn of the unbegotten God, that he himself will pass judgment on the whole human race, unless we found testimonies concerning him published before he came and before he was born as a man, and unless we saw that they were realized accordingly?" Right? In other words, it would be imprudent to believe without prophecies preceding his way. Secondly, it's important to know that these prophecies are preserved by an impartial source. Because somebody could always think, well, if the Christians are preserving the prophecies about Christ, they might have falsified them, right? They might have changed them to support their claim. And so in God's providence, these prophecies, which were entrusted to the Jewish people, are still in public dominion and in the hands of all Jewish people. And it's precisely this book that they conserve until this day, as we do, that testifies to our belief in the Messiah. Okay? So it's an impartial source. In other words, they're conserved both by the Jews that did convert, the apostles and their disciples, and those who didn't. All right, so let's go back to the beginning. What's the first prophecy of the Messiah, and where do we find it? Genesis chapter 3, the threshold of history, the very day of the fall of Adam and Eve. Right? The day of the original sin. And, that might surprise us, but you have to think they needed it. Right? They needed some hope. Because when they realized what they'd done and they'd been expelled from the garden, they could have fallen into despair. And so they hide from God, and God calls them, and they come, and he gives a little discourse to the three protagonists of the fall, who are Adam, Eve, and also the tempter, the serpent, who's obviously not simply a snake, but the figure of Satan, right? The fallen angel. And so God speaks to those three, first to the serpent, then to Eve, and then to Adam. And it's precisely in his punishment or his discourse to the serpent that this promise is given. So he says to the serpent, to Satan, I will put enmity, permanent opposition, enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He, meaning the seed of the woman, shall crush your head, the serpent's head, and you will bruise his heel. It's actually the same verb, to crush the head and to bruise the heel, to crush and to crush. Now the text, it's remarkable, as all Scripture, in so many ways. First, the antiquity of the promise, right? The beginning of human history. So humanity was never without hope in salvation. Right? That's how God planned it. Even though the fulfillment would come centuries later. We don't know how many centuries. We don't know how far back Adam and Eve lived. Whatever it was, countless centuries. We can't go into it here, but it would be interesting also to think about how that revelation was passed on. And we do know that cultural anthropologists, people who study the history of religions, tell us that in every culture of the world, there's some faith in God, but also in a Redeemer. And there's some sense of a fall. Where do these cultures, out in the Pacific and the Aborigines of Australia, the Indians of New Mexico and North and South America, where did these peoples get these ideas? We don't know with certainty, but it's not unreasonable to think that the memory was passed on by Adam and Eve to their descendants and to their descendants' descendants, etc., and that some primeval tradition was kept alive in mankind. Distortions came in, falsehoods entered in, fables, etc., but the basic structure that there was an original sin, we were destined for a supernatural end, for heaven, there was an original sin, a calamity, and God promises a Redeemer. That structure somehow was communicated. And we can think that Adam and Eve passed it on. How did Moses know it? Certainly also by inspiration. Right? God inspired him to know beyond just simply the primeval tradition. Okay, second point. The Messiah is identified here as he who will crush the head of the serpent. And how should we understand that? To crush the head of the enemy of mankind would mean somehow to crush the power of sin and the power of Satan to lead us astray. Right? Which means ultimately to lead us to hell. So to crush the head of the serpent is to destroy his power to bring our souls into hell. So the Messiah, right from the beginning, is set as the opponent of the devil. Right? He's set as he who will oppose the devil and conquer him. And so doing, conquer sin. In another way, we could say that Satan, his mission is his self-given mission is to destroy the glory of God that we talked about last week. And so the Messiah's mission is to restore that glory by crushing the head of the serpent. Satan tried to destroy God's glory by first leading Eve to think badly of God. Right? That was the temptation. that he's trying to keep you down. Right? He gave you that commandment not to eat of the tree of good and evil because he wants to reserve for himself eternal life and knowledge and so forth, and he wants to keep it from you, basically. And so Satan introduced into Eve's mind the idea that God wasn't good in his dealings with mankind. And that she was in competition with him. Right? And he introduces that diabolic idea to make oneself equal to God. Obviously, God wants us to be like him, but not like him by taking his place. Right? Like him by becoming his sons and daughters. So Satan accuses God, and so the seed of the woman, who's the Messiah, who's promised here, will be he who vindicates God's glory by vindicating his goodness. In other words, vindicating that God is love. Right? That will be his task. So the seed of the woman promised will show us, as we know the realization. In hindsight, all prophecy makes sense. Before the fact, it's difficult, right? It's very difficult and obscure. But in hindsight, we know that the promised Messiah vindicated precisely that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. John chapter 3, verse 16. Okay, a third point that we see in this prophecy is that the Messiah will do battle with Satan, and in the battle, precisely while he crushes the head of Satan, he himself will be bruised in his heel. And we can see that as referring to Christ's passion. He's bruised in his humanity. He crushes the serpent precisely by being mortally bruised by Satan on the cross. By suffering, as we'll see later on, every suffering conceivable to the highest degree for the redemption of man. So far, so good. Fourth, this text introduces another point, speaks of the woman. And it's very obscure because the only woman there is Eve. But it can't be Eve that he's speaking of, because he's speaking of, he says, I will put enmity between you, Satan, and the woman. But Eve has precisely just put herself on Satan's side. She's not opposed to Satan. She joined forces, as it were. So what woman is the text speaking of? It doesn't say, right? But nevertheless, it speaks of some woman as if she, without a name, as if she somehow represented womankind, right? As if she represented her whole sex, the woman. And we know in hindsight, again, that this is a Marian prophecy. Right? This speaks of Our Lady as the woman, because from her seed, in other words, from her Son, comes he who will crush the head of the serpent. In other words, the Messiah has a mother who also plays a role. And we can see this as parallel to the fall. God's plan has architecture. It has parallelism, it has proportion, it has beauty. In the fall, two participated, Adam and Eve. Adam had the authority in the sense that he was constituted the head of the human race. And so if it were only Eve that sinned, we wouldn't have inherited original sin, because she wasn't the head. Now, again, that's a whole other discourse. I don't want to get into it. But it was Adam's sin that passed down to us. But nevertheless, his sin was obviously prepared for, was aided, abetted by Eve's sin. There's no doubt about it. If she hadn't prepared for it, he may not have done it. And so in God's plan, both sexes are the mother of the living, Eve, and the head of mankind, Adam, both participate in the sin. It's fitting that the redemption should also involve a new Adam, the Messiah, the seed of the woman, but also a new Eve, the woman who bears birth to the seed. And just as the decisive contribution was Adam's, so too the decisive contribution in the redemption will be the new Adams, the Messiahs, but nevertheless it will be decisively prepared for by a fidelity of the woman. Just as Adam's fall was prepared for by the infidelity, the disobedience, the disbelief, the doubt about God's goodness in the woman, in Eve, so too the redemption will be prepared for by the opposite. The fidelity, the obedience, the love, and the hope and trust of the woman. Again, we know this with hindsight. And we can even take it further. God speaks of an enmity, a perfect enmity between the serpent and the woman. Well, what does it mean to be in perfect opposition with Satan? It means to be in perfect opposition to sin. And as we know, all the rest of us are never in perfect opposition to Satan, because at sometimes we sin, and therefore we do his will. We're not in opposition to him. And thus a perfect enmity would mean someone who is without sin. Right? Again, in hindsight, by faith, we know Our Lady fulfilled that prophecy. Mary. Okay. And the early fathers of the church developed this theme, and maybe we'll come back to it in future weeks if we can. By the way, Jesus indirectly alludes to this prophecy, it seems. It's not certain, but it would seem, when he's dying on the cross. Right? When he's on the cross, in the Gospel of John, we know this, at the foot of the cross, there's his mother standing there. The other disciples have fled, but John, his beloved disciple, is also there. And just before he dies, he says, strangely, "Woman, behold your son." Now, if there were any time in which we would have expected Jesus to call his mother, "My mother," it would have been then when he was about to die. Right? But he says simply, "Woman." Does that mean he's being cold to her? Sometimes, I don't know, Protestants suggest that. But obviously it's not, because he's giving her to us. He's not being cold to her, but he's referring indirectly to this prophecy of the woman. Right? She is the woman, and she gives to her a new son, the beloved disciple, and we see the Catholic tradition, the Church's tradition, sees us included in that gift. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. And we should see that he's given us also his mother at that time. Okay. And that way she becomes the new Eve. Eve was the mother of all the living. And so Catholics believe that Mary is the spiritual mother of those who spiritually live in Christ, engrafted into her son. Which means that we get engrafted also into his mission of crushing the serpent and being bruised. In other words, we share also in the cross of Christ. We, and also Israel, in a mysterious way. Because of Israel's faith in the Messiah, right? It also shares in the mission of the Messiah, which is to redeem humanity by suffering. And again, we'll come back to this more next week when we look at Isaiah. Okay, let's go on in time. So we're beginning of history. Now we come into recorded history. And the Messiah, after, countless centuries, millennia, etc., is again foretold, this time to Abraham. Abraham lives in Mesopotamia, in Ur, today Iraq. And he's called to leave his father's house and his people and to go where God tells him and shows him, precisely to be a blessing for all peoples, a blessing for all nations. So here I've given you some text on the bottom of page 4. "Go forth out of thy country, from thy kindred, and out of thy father's house, and come into the land I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee, magnify thy name, and thou shalt be blessed. I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee." And the culmination is this: "And in thee shall all the kindred of the earth, all the nations of the earth, or families of the earth, be blessed." Right? That's the finality. There are all these. He has to go forth. He has to found a people. God will bless that people. He will multiply that people. He will bless those that bless that people. He will curse those that curse that people. But the culmination of it all is that all nations will be blessed in his seed. So it ends with a universal blessing. And that promise is repeated about 5 times. So let's look at that. It's repeated 6 chapters later, in chapter 18, verse 18, in the mysterious and beautiful section in which 3 angels come to Abraham's house for hospitality. Three men. And he offers them hospitality, and they foretell that at this time next year, he will have a son. Because God had promised him, right? God had promised, in your seed, all nations will be blessed. But he was old, and his wife was likewise sterile and old, past childbearing age. But yet, God had promised that in his seed, all nations will be blessed. And so to carry that out, God has to do something. And so the 3 angels prophesy that he will have a son. And as they go off to Sodom and Gomorrah precisely to destroy it, right? Because of the sins of its inhabitants. And as they set out to go, that blessing is again mentioned. God says, in the person of these angels, "Can I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, which is to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Seeing that he shall become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Right? So again, we have that repeated. And then 4 chapters later, the blessing is again repeated after Abraham is called to sacrifice that very son whose birth had been foretold, and is the promise, he in whom all nations will be blessed. So precisely that son that was prophesied, that Abraham looked on not just simply as a son, which would be enough, but also as the bearer of the prophecy of blessing to all nations, precisely that son God asks him to sacrifice. And Abraham does. Right? Abraham takes him to Mount Moriah, precisely where God shows him, and prepares to sacrifice. By the way, that Mount Moriah is identified in the Jewish tradition precisely with Jerusalem, the place later where the temple will be built and where Calvary is located. Okay, so Abraham takes him there. At the last minute, the angel intervenes, and God says, "By my own self have I sworn, because you have done this thing," in other words, because you've been ready to do this, "and you haven't spared your only begotten son for my sake, I will bless thee. I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, as the sands on the seashore. In thy seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Okay, and then it's repeated again to Abraham's son Isaac, because he's the bearer of that promise. So after the death of Abraham, he says to Isaac, "I will multiply thy seed like the stars of the heaven. I will give to thy posterity all these countries." That means Canaan, the promised land. "And in thy seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice." Okay, now that Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, and which of the 2 sons would that blessing transfer to? Well, Esau, they were twins. Esau is the elder by a tiny bit, but he loses the birthright. Right? He sells it for a pot of porridge, and then Jacob does a trick. We'll talk about that later, perhaps, God willing, suggested by his mother, to get the blessing of the firstborn. Right? And so Jacob becomes the firstborn by not by age, but by having acquired it. And so the blessing transfers to him. Okay? And so God then renews the blessing to Jacob. And it's a great scene. Jacob is being persecuted precisely because of having won the birthright from Esau. And he's being chased. And he's sleeping outside at Bethel, his head on a rock. And he has a dream of a ladder going up to heaven, with the angels of God ascending and descending. And at the top, there's God, who looks down to him and repeats the promise and says, "I am the Lord God of Abraham thy father, the God of Isaac. The land wherein thou sleepest I will give to thee and to thy seed." the promised land. And thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth. Thou shalt be spread abroad to the west, to the east, to the north, to the south. And in thee and in thy seed all the tribes of the earth shall be blessed. And I will be thy keeper whithersoever thou goest, neither will I leave thee till I shall have accomplished all that I have said. Okay, so the promise is repeated again to Jacob. So we see that the very existence of the people Israel is repeatedly connected with the blessing to be given to all nations in their seed. Right? And they're given 4 promises. The land of Canaan will be theirs. They will have descendants as numerous as the stars of the heaven, the sands of the sea. God will bless, assist, and accompany them in an intimate way with his intimate presence, unlike he does with any other people. And fourth, and most importantly, God will bless all nations in the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's very significant that the very existence, multiplication, and blessing of Israel is connected with the universal blessing, right? A blessing for all in them. So a particular people is promised a particular land, which might not seem to concern us today, but this particular, although it certainly would concern them, but this particular blessing is not an end in itself. Right? On the contrary, the promise of Israel's existence and fruitfulness is for the sake of a blessing that affects all the nations of the earth. Right? That's universal. And this obviously contradicts the idea that the Messiah is some national liberator, right? Who comes, some great military figure. How would a Jewish military genius, freeing them from whatever, from the bonds of Roman domination 2,000 years ago or whatever, or today, how would he be a blessing for all the nations on earth? Right? The promise is extraordinary. It's beyond what we can humanly conceive. We can't imagine how that could be realized by our own strength alone. Right? God has to reveal what that means. And he does. Okay, let's go on. Another step. So we've got the prophecy, the promise up to Jacob. Well, what happens after Jacob? Jacob has 12 sons. So to which of those 12 sons will the blessing fall? Right? So we might think the firstborn, Reuben, but it doesn't. And those 12 sons of Jacob, of course, are the origin of the 12 tribes of Israel. So the question is, in which tribe will the Messiah come? Right? That's the question. And Jacob prophesies this on his deathbed. So I'm skipping all kinds of things. Joseph goes off, he's sold into Egypt, he saves the people, the famine, etc. They go back into Egypt to be fed, where Joseph has become the prime minister. Jacob is old, he's blind, he's dying. He calls together his 12 sons, and he gives them all a blessing. That's a prophecy of the future fate of each tribe, basically, of the future destiny of the 12 tribes. This is Genesis chapter 49, and the verse that we're interested in is verse 10. So he goes through, and Judah is the fourth born, and there we find the promise. Why? Who knows? It's not a matter of merit, right? Just as it wasn't a merit for Jacob as opposed to Esau. Well, perhaps there you might see a merit, but here there's no merit. It simply turns out that way. God's gifts are gratuitous. So he goes through first blessing the first 3 with blessings that are rather negative, and they'll be dispersed, etc. But when he gets to Judah, the fourthborn, he says, Judah, thee shall thy brethren praise. Thy hands shall be on the necks of thy enemies. The sons of thy fathers shall bow down to thee. Judah is a lion's whelp. That's where we get the Lion of Judah. Comes from this prophecy. Speaking of his military strength, Judah. And then the key point is this. The scepter shall not be taken away from Judah, nor a ruler from his thigh, from his loins, from his seed, until he come. And this is difficult to translate. One translation gives, until he come that is to be sent. perhaps a better translation, until he comes to whom it belongs. In either case, the idea is the same. To whom what belongs? The scepter. In other words, the scepter, when Jacob's saying this, is there a kingship in Israel? No, he's got 12 sons. But he's saying, of these 12 sons, one day Israel will have a king, and the king will be in the line of Judah. Right? The scepter will be in the line of Judah, and the scepter will stay in the line of Judah until he comes to whom it belongs by some other higher right. Or he comes to who will be sent, in other words, the Messiah. And he shall be the expectation of the nations. Or another translation, to him shall be the obedience of the nations. In other words, again, we find that universal role. He'll be a son of Israel, a son of Judah. He'll have a kingship, but it will extend to all the nations. And then in the last verse of this prophecy, it's very mysterious, hard to understand, but it says, he shall wash his robe in wine and his garment in the blood of the grape. And this seems to refer to bloodshed. One might think the blood of his enemies, but again, with hindsight, we see that as a reference to the passion of the Messiah, that he will wash his robe in blood, his own, for the redemption of man. I don't say that you could get that just simply by reading that verse without knowing what's happened afterwards. But again, all prophecy is understood properly after the fact. So according to this prophecy, the kingship in Israel shall be in the tribe of Judah, right? As will be the Messiah. Other tribes have other dignity. The tribe of Levi has the priesthood, sons of Aaron, but the kingship is reserved for Judah and the Messiah for Judah. The sons of Joseph, now one might have expected, what happened to Joseph in all this? Why wasn't he chosen to be the father of the Messiah? Well, again, we don't know. Because obviously Joseph was the hero among the 12 sons of Jacob, but he was passed over. He gets temporal prosperity. His 2 sons become 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they extend and become very prosperous for a time, but then they're lost. The 10 northern tribes are taken to Assyria and disappear from history. So Joseph is cut off in that sense. Okay. Let's go on to the next prophecy, which is centuries later. So the Jewish people are in Egypt. They stay there for 4 centuries. They expand, they multiply, etc. They fall into slavery. They're released by Moses. They go in the promised land. All of this time, we don't have any new prophecy. And oddly enough, the first new prophecy about the Messiah comes from an unlikely source. One would have thought perhaps Moses would give a prophecy. And he does later, we'll see. But the most important one, comes from a pagan prophet, a Moabite, who's hired by his king to curse Israel as they pass through Moab on their way to the promised land. And so Balaam is his name, Balaam with his famous ass who speaks to him, this Moabite prophet, and is hired to curse them. And he says that he can't curse them because God is forcing him to bless them, even though it means that he's going to lose his job and who knows what temporal misfortune will occur to him. And so he blesses them in a very interesting way. This is in the book of Numbers, chapter 24, verses 17 to 19. So he starts out by saying, "How beautiful are thy tabernacles, O Jacob, and thy tents, O Israel." So just giving a general praise to Israel. But the prophecy culminates in something future, not present. He says, "I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not near. A star shall arise out of Jacob, and a scepter shall spring forth from Israel, and shall strike the chiefs of Moab, and shall waste all the children of Seth." I'll explain that in a minute. "Out of Jacob shall he come that shall rule, and shall destroy the remains of the city. It's very obscure, like all prophecies, until you get the key. But the first thing to notice is that it's something that concerns the distant future. Right? This prophet Balaam sees a present army passing through their country. He's not able to curse them, but he says his prophecy centers on something centuries away, something distant, something that doesn't concern any of them standing there. And this future prophecy concerns a star, obviously, again, the Messiah, and we can connect it to Jacob's prophecy, a scepter. He says, a scepter shall spring up from Israel, and it will have again a universal dominion. And where do we see that? He shall waste all the children of Seth. Who is Seth? Seth is the son of Adam after Cain and Abel. Right? So Adam and Eve have two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain kills the good son, Abel, and to replace him, Adam and Eve come together again and have Seth. Now, the chapters 4 and 5 of Genesis speak of a certain conflict between the lineage of Cain and the lineage of Seth. The lineage of Cain, we find technology and certain human progress. But in the lineage of Seth, we find the worship of God. They're the first ones who call on the name of the Lord. And it's from the line of Seth that we get Noah and all the people on the earth today would be sons of Noah and of Seth. Right? The line of Cain got extinct, according to the Bible, in the flood. So, to speak of the sons of Seth is the same as speaking of the sons of Adam. In other words, he will have a universal dominion, this scepter, this star that will rise in Jacob. Okay, that's the idea. Again, it's not the first time. All the prophecies say the same, that he will be blessing for all people, or in this case, he will be a scepter for all people. In other words, he'll have a dominion that is universal. Okay. Now, we can't apply that prophecy to any other historical figure that we know. Right? We couldn't say that David or Solomon, great warriors that they were, conquered and subdued all the children of Seth. By the way, that reference to Seth may also indicate the just. In other words, that he will have a dominion over the sons of Seth, in a sense, refers to perhaps the righteous. I'll just put that in parentheses. Obviously, the type of conquest that's intended is spiritual, not military. In other words, the conversion of the sons of Seth to the worship of the true God. Okay, another prophecy is given by Moses. Roughly the same time. They've gone through the 40 years in the desert, wandering. And at the end of that wandering, Moses, before he dies before they enter the promised land. Before he dies, he gives a great sermon to the people, which is the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is precisely, at least in its literary form, a long sermon by Moses to the people before they enter the promised land and before he dies. And in this great book, Deuteronomy, the basis of Jewish life is set forth. Again, there's a second law. That's the name Deuteronomy means second law. It's a restatement of the Ten Commandments from Exodus and the basis of Jewish life. And in the course of this, Moses speaks of the institutions of Israel, kingship, the future kingship, the place of worship, the tabernacle, etc. And he speaks of the office of prophecy, the institution of prophecy. And he says, how do you recognize a true prophecy? Well, it comes true, and a false prophecy it doesn't. But then he goes on and he says, he speaks of another prophet in the singular. This is Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 to 19. He says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet, singular, like me, from among you, from your brethren. Him you shall heed, right? Him you shall obey. And he says the same thing again. The Lord said to me, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren. I will put my words into his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whosoever shall give heed to who will not give heed to my words, which he will speak in my name, I will be the revenger. In other words, he will be a new Moses with the same authority as Moses, to whom the obedience due to God was due. And by the way, St. Peter speaks of this very prophecy in Acts chapter 3. Shortly after Pentecost, when the lame man is cured in the temple, the first miracle worked by Peter and John in the Acts of the Apostles, and he's speaking to the people, and he says that Jesus was precisely the prophet prophesied by Moses, and that we are to heed him in the same way that we heeded Moses, and we still do. In other words, the Messiah is to be the new Moses. Now, to understand this, we have to reflect on what is the role of Moses in the formation of the Jewish people. Right? He was the mediator between God and the people. Right? So the new Moses will likewise be a new mediator between God and his people. Moses was the legislator. He gave the law in God's name and explained it. So the new Moses likewise will be a new legislator speaking God's will to man, right? As we see realized, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount. Moses sealed a covenant with the Jewish people at the foot of Mount Sinai in blood, right? In the blood of sacrifices. So the new Moses, it's reasonable to think likewise, will seal a new covenant. And we'll have more prophecies on that, which we'll do next week. But I won't get into that today. And just as Moses liberated the people from Egypt and the house of bondage, so too we should expect the new Moses to liberate God's people from bondage. And we'll see a higher form of bondage, the bondage of sin, right? Connecting it back to the crushing of the head of the serpent. And just as Moses led them through the waters of the Red Sea, so too the new Moses will lead them through new waters, which we know are baptism. Just as Moses was said to be the meekest man of all the men on the earth, it's reasonable to expect the new Moses, likewise, to be exceptional precisely in being meek and humble of heart. Let's pass now more centuries, several centuries, up to the time of David. So now we said that Jacob prophesied that the kingship would be in the line of Judah. But the first king, is he in the line of Judah? No. The first king, that the last judge, Samuel, there was a period of judges in which there was no king, right after they came to the promised land, centuries. And the last judge is Samuel, and he anoints a king against his will, but the people demanded it. And he anoints Saul, who's from the tribe of Benjamin. Right? He's not from Judah. So what happened to the prophecy of Jacob? Of course, we know that he lost the kingship by being unfaithful to God. And so Samuel anointed him. He also told him in God's name that he had lost his God-given authority to be king in Israel and that had been given to another who was David, right? The youngest of his father's family, etc., the one child out tending the flocks. So Samuel anointed David king, and David is from the tribe of Judah. Okay, and so that promise given previously to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah is now passed on to David. To David it is revealed that in his seed the Messiah will come. Right? So again, it's specified. And this occurred after David was successful in subduing Saul and his other enemies. He built his capital in Jerusalem. The tabernacle of the Lord is found, and he wants to introduce it into Jerusalem and build a temple. And he proposes this to the prophet Nathan, and the prophet says, sure, because after all, David lived in this house, a palace, and the Lord, the Holy of Holies, was in a tent. It seemed fitting that he make a temple for the Lord. And so Nathan says yes, but then he goes home, and in the night, God speaks to Nathan and says, no, and say to David that he won't build it. It will be a son who will build it. And this is the second book of Samuel, chapter 7, verse 14. When thy days shall be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will raise up thy seed after thee, who will proceed out of thy bowels, out of thy seed, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house to my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And if he commit any iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy I will not take away from him, as I took it from Saul, etc. And thy house shall ever be faithful, and thy kingdom forever before thy face. Thy throne shall be firm forever. So now, who does this refer to? On one hand, David did have a son who did build the temple, and that was King Solomon. So the prophecy is partly fulfilled in David's his immediate son, Solomon, who built the temple to the Lord, had peace in his reign, but nevertheless, was his kingdom eternal? The fact is that it wasn't. He had a glorious kingship, but at his death, the 10 northern tribes split off. And in fact, his kingship over all Israel lasted no more than his own lifetime, Solomon's. And so you see there's more in the prophecy than was fulfilled in Solomon. Right? It would be, if we were to think that that prophecy, that your throne will be established forever, simply referred to Solomon, that would be a kind of exaggeration on the part of God. And God doesn't exaggerate. On the contrary, if anything, he understates. Right? In other words, his words come true in a much higher way than we imagine. Right? And so that son, well, yes, in part it was Solomon, but Solomon is the figure of another son who will build another temple and will establish another kingdom that will have no end. And obviously we know, again, in hindsight, that kingdom and that temple is spiritual, not material. Every material temple has an end. Every material kingdom and temporal kingdom has an end. Right? The only kingdom that lasts forever is the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, which the Messiah inaugurated, and it's the church. We'll speak more about this next week. And also, we'll come back to this point. To him I will be a father, and he shall be to me a son. That's, in other words, the son of David that's spoken of in this text is to be a son of God in an altogether unique way. Not as Solomon was. All the Israelites are sons of God in the sense that they were adopted to be God's people. But this son seems to be a unique sonship. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. We'll come back to that next week. Okay, so in this text we see that the Messiah has to be a son of David, of the line of David. And there are many other, we don't have time to go into it, many other texts that speak of the fact that the Messiah will be a son of David. We see it in Jeremiah, chapter 25. He speaks of the shoot of David. We'll see it in Isaiah, the shoot of Jesse, Jesse being the grandfather of David. We see it in several Psalms, Psalm 89, Psalm 132, which speak of the promise given to David and how that promise is of a king who will have an everlasting kingdom, right? And a scepter that will never be taken away. Confirmed forever. And we see at the time of the Gospels that belief that the Messiah would be the son of David was just simply universal. It was commonplace. Everyone knew it. The beggar on the street knew that the Messiah had to be the son of David. Right? And he shouts out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, Davidic descent could be verified in those days, right? The Jews kept very elaborate genealogies, precisely, in part, I'm sure, no doubt, because of the messianic expectation. Right? They were very concerned about genealogy. But today, are there sons of David still historically identifiable? The answer is no. Right? The last traces of members of the clan of David, as far as I know, disappears from history in about the 2nd and 3rd century A.D. The last members that history records of that family were the brothers, quote unquote, of Jesus, which we understand to be cousins, in other words, of that same family, who after the death of Jesus become bishops in Jerusalem. James the Lesser, we know from different sources, also from Josephus and secular sources, was bishop in Jerusalem until the year 62, in which he was martyred. And after his death, another brother of Jesus, another one from the same family, took his place, and they continued till the end of the first century to be bishops in Jerusalem. And then in this following century, we hear of a few other members of that family until all trace is lost in about the 3rd and 4th century. So that prophecy that the Messiah will be son of David today is unrealizable, right? In a historical way. I mean, it's impossible to document it. It's interesting, the Jews had a great military leader in the 2nd century before Christ, Judas Maccabeus, right? There's 2 books in the Bible about Judas, great hero defending the law against Antiochus, right? The enemy of the people. That's where we get the celebration of Hanukkah. But nobody ever said, as far as I know, that Judas was the Messiah. Why not? He was a great military leader. He saved his people from foreign domination. He saved the law. He saved the temple. He wasn't of the tribe of Judah, and he wasn't a son of David. Right? He was simply ruled out by that. And there were many false messiahs. We'll talk about them in a later talk. None of them, as far as I know, ever could show that they were sons of David, at least not to my knowledge. And it's amazing that the lineage of David was conserved for so many centuries, despite many attempts to annihilate it, right? And why did they want to annihilate it? Precisely for political reasons. The last attempt to annihilate the line of David was done by Herod, right? With the massacre of the innocents. He was trying to extirpate anybody who could be a rival by being able to say that he was a son of David. Okay. I've given you another prophecy, Psalm 72, about the kingly role of the Messiah. The Messiah will be a new David. And just as David was a great king with a great empire with people sending tribute to him, but yet judging with justice, judging the poor, etc., so too the Messiah will be a new David in that sense. Psalm 72 is beautiful. He shall judge the poor of the people. He shall save the children of the poor. He shall humble the oppressor. He shall continue with the sun before the moon throughout all generations. Again, it can't apply to Solomon or David. He will continue for all generations. May the kings of Tarshish and the isles render him tribute. In other words, the various nations of the world. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring him gifts. May all kings fall down before him. All nations serve him. And he shall rule from sea to sea, from river unto the ends of the earth. And in him all the tribes of the earth shall be blessed. Right? Going back to the prophecy made to Abraham. So how can we understand this of any mere man, that he has a kingship that endures forever, universal in space and time? Right? Who can be king for all generations? The eternal character of the Messianic kingdom rules out any temporal interpretation of the Messianic prophecy. Now, Catholics recognize several dimensions to the universal reign of Christ. Right? That is the Messiah. Universal, by divine right. Universal in the sense that the kings of the earth give tribute. Now, the Messiah didn't come to establish a temporal kingship, right? A temporal rule, but a spiritual kingdom, and the temporal kingdoms continue. But those temporal kingdoms can recognize God and his rights, right? And that's what happened in the ages of Christendom. Right? The kings of the earth gave tribute to Christ in so many ways. We think of St. Louis, for whom we're named here. Right? It's a perfect example of the kings of Tarshish giving tribute to the Messiah King. And then finally, it's universal and eternal because he's judge, right? And his kingdom involves two dimensions: the church militant on earth and the church triumphant in heaven, which has no end. Okay. And let's go on to we're running out of time, but I'll just do a few more. The prophecy of the virgin birth. Now this is, we all know from Christmas, etc., one of the most beautiful of the Messianic prophecies was given to a very seemingly unworthy person, King Ahaz, one of the descendants of David, and not a king with many faults. And Isaiah recounts the story in chapter 7 of the book of Isaiah. At this point, Ahaz was threatened by a coalition between Syria and the northern kingdoms, and they were threatening to conquer Judah and put someone else on the throne of David, who would not be of the line of David. In other words, they would put a foreigner on the throne of David. And so Ahaz is worried. And Isaiah is sent to tell him not to worry, to be confident, to trust, to believe. Ahaz, it seems, doesn't believe. He's looking for a political, temporal solution. And so Isaiah instructs him to ask for a sign of God, that God would intervene. And Ahaz, strangely, says no, because in a kind of apparently false humility, I don't want to tempt God by asking for a sign, so he doesn't ask. And so Isaiah says in God's name, I myself will provide one. And that sign is the birth of a son by a virgin. It goes, therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. Now, prophecies are always difficult. And this one is certainly no less difficult than others. And the reason for the difficulty is because very often two levels are mixed, an immediate level and a distant level. Right? Just as with the prophecy given by Balaam. On one hand, it concerned the Israelite people passing through his land. On the other hand, he speaks about a distant event 12 centuries later. Or the prophecy given to David. On the one hand, part of it referred to his son Solomon. But the principal part referred to something that would happen 10 centuries later. Likewise here, part of it referred to his own son, Hezekiah, who would save Israel for a time, not through his own actually prowess, but simply through a miracle of God. But the principal part of this prophecy obviously concerns something distant, 7 centuries further along. And we can see that because precisely the mention of a virgin birth. Now, this has been the origin of a tremendous controversy. The Hebrew word, I don't want to burden you with it, but the Hebrew word that's used there, Alma, is a very infrequent word in the Bible. It comes up about 4 or 5 times. And it means a young woman who's still unmarried. Now, when the Bible was translated from Hebrew into Greek in the 3rd century BC, it was a translation done by Hebrew scholars, right, Jewish scholars of the 3rd century. When they came to translate that, they chose precisely the word virgin, which shows us that in the 3rd century BC, the Jewish understanding of this text was that it wasn't just any woman who would give birth to a son, but a virgin would. And the reason is not hard to understand, because if you just simply say, the sign will be this, a woman shall conceive and give birth to a son, well, that's not a sign, because that happens every day, right? A sign has to be something extraordinary. And that a virgin give birth is so extraordinary that I don't know of any parallel even being claimed of any person in any kind of realistic sense in all of history, except one. And it goes on, his name shall be called Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. And the son of King Ahaz, Ezekiel, nobody ever said that he somehow was God with us. Right? In other words, the very name given shows us that it's something altogether extraordinary. Right? And precisely, it was always understood to be a messianic prophecy in the early centuries. In other words, the Messiah will be God's presence among men. And that entrance, in other words, if it's God present among men, it's reasonable, it's not unreasonable, that God would want to enter into history in a unique way by being, yes, the son of a human mother, but not of a human father, to show that he comes from above. Right? We're from below. In other words, to connect this with King Ahaz, Ahaz basically was, the situation was this. Human plots, human politics was trying to suppress the Davidic line. And God said, my plan, basically, will not be interrupted by human politics, by human devices, by human effort. Precisely because it's a divine plan, it has to be realized by divine effort, as it were. Right? And so the sign of the virgin birth is connected with the attempt to suppress the Davidic line in which the promise was given. Okay, we've seen the lineage of the Messiah. What about, does the Bible tell us where it's to happen? And we know the answer is yes. Again, this was common knowledge at the time of the New Testament, because we know from the Gospel of Matthew, when the three Magi came in, they'd seen the sign, the star. They come to Jerusalem. They ask, where is the Messiah to be born? Herod didn't know because he wasn't learned in the law, but he asked the scribes and the priests, and of course they knew, Bethlehem. And how did they know? From the prophet Micah, who says in chapter 5 that it will be Bethlehem. Chapter 5, verse 2. And thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, another name, thou art a little one among the clans of Judah. In other words, Bethlehem was a tiny city, a village among the cities of Judah. In a sense, one of the least of the cities of Judah. Out of thee shall come forth unto me he who is to be a ruler in Israel. And his going forth is from the beginning, from the days of eternity, from the days of antiquity. In other words, this text makes mention of the idea that the Messiah pre-exists. Well, I'll talk about that in a minute. First thing you notice, it's a very specific prophecy, a particular place. It's like saying the Messiah will be born in Chesterfield, or something like that, right? In Bethlehem. And in the 2nd century, we know that St. Justin Martyr, he was from Palestine, he was able to say to the emperor, before he was martyred in Rome, and he made an apology to the emperor, I forget which, Antoninus Pius, one of the Roman emperors, in which he spoke about the prophecies and the realization. He said, and this prophecy was realized, and we have proof of it because we still have records of the census made under Cyrenius, your first procurator, etc. Obviously, they don't exist anymore, but at that time, apparently they did. Secondly, the text refers to a dual birth and nature of the Messiah. Right? He's born in a particular place, in a particular time, but yet his going forth is from eternity. And that was actually a common belief of the rabbis in the centuries before Christ, that the Messiah pre-existed forever with God somehow. And we saw last week when we looked at the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, that the wisdom of God is seen to be distinct from God the Father, and yet from the beginning. And his delight, he says, is to be with the sons of men. Right? And so it's not unreasonable to connect that figure of the eternal wisdom of God, of the Father, with the Messiah, for his going forth is from eternity. We see evidence of this belief in other non-biblical books written about this time in the 2nd century BC. The first book of Enoch, which speaks of this Messiah as the Son of Man, who existed from the beginning with God. It says, he shall be a light unto the nations, the worship and praise and blessing of all peoples will be on him. He has been chosen and hidden before God, even before the creation of the world and forevermore. Okay, I'd like to close with one last prophecy about the time. So far we've seen, I'm sorry I'm going a little over, but let's just conclude with this. We've seen the lineage, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David. We've seen the place, Bethlehem. What about the time? Well, we know some things. We've already said it had to be of the line of David. Therefore, it had to be before the line of David became lost to history. Secondly, we saw it had to be before the sovereignty was completely lost to Israel. When did that occur? It was completely lost in the year 70 AD, when Israel was conquered by, not just conquered, but demolished, burnt to the ground by the Emperor Titus, year 70 AD. And at that point, Israel was taken to diaspora. It was made even worse. 60 years later, a second revolt. The year 132, they were taken, again dispersed among the peoples, and all sovereignty was lost for 1,800 years. So it had to be before that time. And then finally, we have a prophecy that makes a more specific indication, but it's very obscure. It's Daniel chapter 9, and it's fantastic. Daniel was a prophet at the time of the Babylonian exile, the 6th century BC. Right? And he's taken into exile as a very young man. And in that exile, he's praying. He tells us that he's praying for the forgiveness of the sins of his people. And he's contemplating a promise made by God that the exile would last 70 years. And we find that in the book of Jeremiah, that the exile would be 70 years in Babylon, and then they would be able to go back to Israel. And it occurred. So he's making this prayer, and the angel Gabriel comes to him to give him consolation. But the angel doesn't give the consolation we might have expected. We would have expected some kind of consolation about the end of the exile and about those 70 years that he's praying about. But instead, the angel tells him about 70 weeks of years. In other words, a period of 7 times 70, 490 years. And he speaks precisely of the messianic consolation, of a greater consolation. So I'll just read it to you. It's difficult. The angel says this to Daniel. 70 weeks are decreed upon thy people and upon thy holy city, that transgression may be finished, sin may have an end, and iniquity may be abolished, and everlasting justice may be brought in. Now, what is that referring to? Again, the crushing of the head of the serpent, that the Messiah will somehow conquer sin, abolish sin, and bring in justice. Everlasting. Vision and prophecy will be fulfilled. In other words, all prophecy points to that. And from that point on, it's in a sense concluded. The saint of saints, or the holy of holies, will be anointed. The idea of anointing is precisely the Messiah. Know therefore, and take notice, from the going forth of the word to build Jerusalem again after the exile, until the coming of the Messiah, the Prince, Christ, right? Christ is simply Greek for Messiah. There shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. In other words, 69 weeks, some 480 or 90 years. And in this time, the wall will be built again in distress of times, in troubled times. And after 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be slain. The people shall deny him, and the people that shall deny him shall not be his. That's an obscure text there. And the people with their leader that shall come shall destroy the city, the sanctuary, and the end will be waste. So just in summary, we've got, we can say 4 elements. We've got the time frame, some 490 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem after the exile. First element. Secondly, the Messiah will be cut off. The Messiah dies. Very strange, right? Because we have this idea of an everlasting king. Third, the Messiah will abolish iniquity somehow. Right? We'll talk more about that next week. And fourth, the Messiah will be followed by the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Now, the decree that's mentioned here, we know from other parts of the Bible, took place in the mid-5th century BC, sometime after the exile. King Artaxerxes I gave a decree, and we can read about that in chapter 7 of the book of Ezra. So we can put that date at something like 460 BC, more or less. And if we go 490 years or 480 years, that takes us to about the year 30, more or less. Right? And we shouldn't be too exact with numbers in the Bible. They give a general picture. Right? But in any case, it puts us right in the time frame of the death of Jesus, right, on the cross. And it's very possible that we know from the New Testament that the Jewish people were in a kind of fever of messianic expectation in the beginning of the 1st century AD, the time of Jesus. Right? We saw that there were the prophet, the Rabbi Gamaliel, makes reference to other false prophets, false messiahs before Jesus. And then we know from history about others after Jesus with terrible consequences. They led revolts against Rome, and it resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 and again in 130. Right? So there was an expectation of the Messiah. Why was there such expectation? It's reasonable to connect it with this prophecy of Daniel. People made a calculation of the time. But the most important thing to see here is the spiritual dimension. The Messiah comes to abolish iniquity and to install everlasting righteousness. In other words, to reconcile man with God. Not to establish a temporal kingship. On the contrary, he will be slain and the nation will be destroyed. That's what the prophecy indicates. Next time we'll look at how to reconcile. See, you can see that before the event, it would be very, very difficult to understand the messianic prophecies. Because they speak of an eternal kingship, and at the same time they speak of a king who will be slain and a city that will be destroyed. So we'll come back to this next week, and we'll look, above all, at the prophecies concerning the suffering of the Messiah. And we'll look at Isaiah, and we'll look at the prophecies concerning the conversion of the peoples by the work of the Messiah next week. Okay, thank you. So let's take a break, and then there'll be questions. So for your questions, I think the best thing is to write them down on some kind of, I've got paper here. So just write them down on an index card, and then that way I can read them into the microphone, and they'll get recorded. All right, so let's take a break, and then we'll have questions. Thank you.